Nobody told me that working the closing shift at a hospital gala could change the entire direction of my life. I wasn't supposed to be there that night. Keiko had called in sick around 4 in the afternoon, and my supervisor, a tired woman named Brenda, who always smelled faintly of hand sanitizer and coffee, had texted me with that particular kind of desperation that doesn't leave room for saying no. "Can you cover the Harborview fundraiser tonight? It's the cardiology wing gala, black tie event. Please." I'd said yes because I needed the money. My lease renewal was coming up in 3 weeks, and my landlord in East Vancouver had raised the rent by $400, which in Vancouver means you either find the money or you find a new city. So I put on the white button-down and the black trousers. I drove my 15-year-old Civic to the Fairmont Pacific Rim, and I walked into a ballroom full of people who spent more on their shoes than I made in a month. That's the thing about catering work. You become invisible. The people at those tables, the surgeons, the board members, the donors whose names were printed on hospital wings, they look through you like you're part of the furniture, which means you see everything. And I saw something that night that I was never supposed to see. The gala was for the new Cardiac Research Center, a $40 million expansion of St. Paul's Hospital. The room smelled like lilies and money. Centerpieces that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget sat on every table. A string quartet played something elegant in the corner. I moved through the crowd with a tray of smoked salmon canapés, refilling champagne flutes, trying to stay out of the way of the senior staff who knew the room better than I did. The main table, the one near the window, overlooking the harbor, was where the important people sat. I'd been briefed on this by Marco, the event coordinator, who had the energy of someone who hadn't slept in 48 hours and the vocal delivery of a man narrating a nature documentary. "That's Dr. Harland and his wife," he'd whispered, pointing discreetly toward a silver-haired couple near the center. "He's the chief of cardiology, just retired. Tonight's gala is partly in his honor. The hospital is naming the new research wing after him. Be careful around that table. Careful with everything." I'd nodded and carried on. Dr. Harland was in his mid-60s, the kind of man who had clearly been handsome when he was young, and had aged into something that commanded attention without trying. He wore a tuxedo the way men who've worn tuxedos for 40 years wear them, like a second skin. His wife sat beside him, a woman I later learned was named Laurel, maybe 10 years younger than him, gracious in that careful, practiced way of women who've spent decades at events like this one. Across the table from them sat their son-in-law. I didn't know who he was at first. I noticed him the way you notice someone who makes a room feel slightly smaller just by being in it. He was maybe 40, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that was either charming or dangerous depending on the context. He laughed at something Dr. Harland said, and the laugh was too big, too easy, the laugh of someone who has learned how to perform warmth. Beside him sat the doctor's daughter. She was the one who made me stop for a moment, just briefly, before I caught myself and moved on. She was about my age, late 20s, maybe early 30s, and she was beautiful in the way that exhausted people sometimes are, a kind of beauty that had worry folded into it. She wasn't laughing at whatever her husband was laughing at. She was watching her champagne glass like it contained something that might tell her what to do next. Her name, I found out from the seating card when I passed close enough to read it, was Dr. Harland's daughter, and the card beside her read Mr. Ashford, VP Operations, Pinnacle Capital Group. I remember thinking, Pinnacle Capital Group. I'd seen that name somewhere recently. I kept moving. The evening went the way those evenings go. Speeches, applause. A video presentation about the cardiac research wing that made half the room emotional. Dr. Harland stood and said a few words that were genuinely moving. He talked about a patient he'd lost 30 years ago, a 12-year-old boy, and how that loss had driven everything he'd built since. People cried. His wife held his hand. Even his son-in-law, Ashford, looked appropriately solemn. But I was watching Ashford's phone. I don't know why I was watching it. Something about him had snagged my attention in that low-grade, unspecific way that your gut sometimes notices things before your brain catches up. He'd been on his phone more than seemed appropriate for a gala in his father-in-law's honor. Short messages. Quick replies. The kind of texting you do when you're managing something that needs managing. Around 9:30, I was collecting empty glasses from the side tables near the window when I passed close to a corridor that led to the coat check and the private dining rooms. I wasn't supposed to be in that corridor. I was turning back when I heard voices. 2 men. I didn't recognize either voice at first. The filing happens Monday morning. By Tuesday, everything moves. And Harland has no idea. He signed the consent forms 6 weeks ago. He thought he was authorizing a routine investment review. He didn't read the fine print. Nobody ever reads the fine print. A pause. The daughter? She doesn't know anything. Ashford's kept her completely in the dark. That's the whole point. She's his credibility. Married into the family, trusted by the board, everyone thinks he's. I stopped breathing. I flattened myself against the wall, tray pressed against my chest, and I stood completely still because I understood, in a sudden cold rush, exactly what I was hearing. Ashford was using Dr. Harland's name, his reputation, his retirement endowment, to move money. And the filing on Monday morning was going to be the moment it became irreversible. The old man, whose face I'd just watched crumple with genuine emotion, while talking about a 12-year-old boy he'd lost 3 decades ago, had no idea that his son-in-law had forged his understanding of what he'd signed. I knew about this because I had a journalism degree I'd never used, from Carleton University, completed 4 years ago, and currently gathering dust while I paid off my student loans by carrying canapés at charity galas. I knew about financial fraud because I'd done a 4th-year thesis on it. I knew what filing on Monday meant in the context of what I'd just heard. I knew that by Tuesday, whatever Dr. Harland thought he owned, whatever the hospital thought was secured, would be very different from the reality. I moved away from the corridor before they came out. My hands were shaking. I set the tray down on a side table and pressed my palms flat against the linen and told myself to think clearly. Think about what you actually know. Think about what you heard versus what you're inferring. Think about whether there's any version of this that isn't what it sounds like. I couldn't find one. I stood in that ballroom for the next 40 minutes, carrying glasses and appetizers and smiling at people who didn't see me, and I thought about what to do. I thought about going to Brenda, who would tell me to stay out of it and not jeopardize the catering contract. I thought about calling the police, and then I thought about how that conversation would go. Yes, I was eavesdropping in a corridor at a fundraiser, and I heard 2 men talking, and I think it might be financial fraud, and I could hear how that would land. I thought about saying nothing, but I kept looking at Dr. Harland. He was at his table, talking with the hospital's board chair, animated and engaged, the way people are when they're in a room full of their life's work. His wife had her hand on his arm. His daughter was listening, and for a moment she laughed at something her father said, a real laugh, not the performed one. And her face opened up and she looked young and unguarded for just a second. She didn't know. That was the thing I kept coming back to. She didn't know that the man she'd married had spent however long using her family as a vehicle. She didn't know that Monday morning was going to arrive and take something from her father that he'd worked 40 years to build. I made my decision. I wasn't going to go to Dr. Harland. I didn't have enough, not in a way that would land clearly with a man mid-celebration, surrounded by board members, 3 glasses of wine, into a gala in his own honor. I couldn't hand him something that complex in that context. He'd smile and nod, and I'd be dismissed, and then Ashford would know something had shifted, and he'd accelerate whatever he was planning. I needed to go to the daughter. Her name was on the seating card beside her father's. Dr. Harland's daughter, Meredith Ashford née Harland. She was standing now, near the dessert table, slightly apart from the group, holding a glass of sparkling water instead of champagne. She looked like someone who'd excused herself from the conversation without technically leaving. I walked toward her. I picked up a dessert plate from the nearest station, crème brûlée, like I was delivering it. And I approached her from the left because that was the side away from where Ashford was standing 30 feet away, talking to a man in a gray suit. I set the plate down on the table near her. I didn't look at her directly. I adjusted the dessert spoon. I kept my voice low and level. The voice of someone telling you what the soup of the day is. I'm sorry to disturb you, I said, but I heard something tonight that I think you need to know. Not here. If you can excuse yourself in the next 10 minutes. The women's lounge, 2nd floor. I'll wait for you there. Please don't mention this to your husband. I picked up the tray. I walked away without looking back. For the next 8 minutes, I stood in the second-floor women's lounge, and I convinced myself I'd made a terrible mistake. She wasn't going to come. She was going to tell Ashford. Ashford was going to have me removed from the building, and call Brenda, and I was going to lose the contract and $400 of rent money I didn't have. The door opened. She walked in with the careful composure of someone who has been trained since childhood to walk into rooms without showing what she's feeling. The door swung shut behind her. She looked at me, really looked at me, in the way that people usually don't look at catering staff, and she said, quietly, "What did you hear?" I told her everything. All of it. The corridor, the 2 voices, the specific phrases, the filing on Monday, the consent forms, the fine print. I told her about my thesis. I told her that I could be wrong, that I might have misunderstood context, but that I could not stand in that ballroom for the rest of the evening and say nothing while her father shook hands and gave speeches about the work of his lifetime. She stood very still while I talked. When I finished, she didn't say anything for a long moment. She looked at the mirror above the vanity counter without really seeing it. Then she said, "How long have you known about the Capital Group?" I said I hadn't, until tonight. That I'd just recognized the name vaguely. She said, quietly, "I've been trying to find the right question to ask for 6 months." And something in her voice, the way it was steady and exhausted at exactly the same time, made me understand that some part of her had already known. Not the specifics. Not Monday's filing or the forged consent forms. But the outline. The shape of the wrong thing, visible in peripheral vision, which she hadn't been able to look at directly until a stranger in a catering uniform handed her a reason to. "I need to make a call," she said. "I need you to wait here for 5 minutes." She made the call. I don't know who she called. I stood by the window and looked out at the harbor lights and listened to her speak in a very low, very controlled voice on the other end of the line. She gave names, dates. She repeated what I'd said about the filing. She said, yes, I know. I'll handle it." When she hung up, she looked at me again. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know," I said. She nodded slowly. "My father, he's not." She stopped, started again. "He's worked his whole life honestly. He doesn't deserve this." "No," I agreed. "He doesn't." She was quiet again for a moment. Then she said something I didn't expect. "Are you actually a journalist?" I said no. "Just someone who studied it and ended up doing something else." She almost smiled at that. "Sometimes that's the most dangerous thing to be," she said. "Someone who knows how to look but isn't expected to be looking." She left before I did. She went back out to the gala. And when I came down, 10 minutes later, she was at the table with her father and her husband, and her face was perfectly arranged and she was smiling. And Ashford was refilling her glass, and you would never have known. But I watched her father lean over and say something in her ear, and I watched her squeeze his hand, once, briefly, and I knew she'd said something to him. Not everything. Enough. I collected glasses for another 45 minutes. Ashford left early. Around 10:30, something about a call he had to take. He kissed Meredith on the cheek and shook Dr. Harlan's hand, and Dr. Harlan shook it back with the warmth of a man who didn't yet know, and the whole thing was so ordinary-looking that I had to remind myself what I'd heard in that corridor. The gala wrapped up around 11. I stacked glassware onto carts and helped the kitchen crew break down the dessert stations and carried tablecloths to the laundry bags, and the ballroom that had been full of flowers and string quartets and $40 million promises became just a large empty room with scuff marks on the floor. Brenda found me near the service entrance. "Good work tonight," she said. "Client was happy." "Thanks," I said. She gave me a look that suggested she could tell something was different about me. But Brenda was not the kind of person to ask about the interiority of catering staff. So she just nodded and went to find Marco. I drove home on the Granville Bridge with the windows down. It was October, and the air coming off the water was cold in that particular Vancouver way. Damp and clean, and slightly bitter, like the city reminding you it existed before all of this. I had $40 in my bank account and rent going up in 3 weeks, and a journalism degree that I'd spent 4 years on and never used. I thought about what Meredith had said. Someone who knows how to look but isn't expected to be looking. I thought about that for a long time. The story broke 11 days later. I found out through the news like everyone else, though I recognized every name in it. A financial fraud investigation into an investment vehicle associated with Pinnacle Capital Group. Allegations of forged consent documentation. A prominent Vancouver cardiologist whose retirement endowment had been used without his knowledge. The suspect, a VP named Ashford, whose connection to the Harland family was noted carefully and then set aside, had been flagged to the BC Securities Commission before the Monday filing could go through. The timing. The Monday filing that didn't happen. Someone had called it in before Monday. I sat in my apartment with my laptop and a cup of tea, and I read the whole article 3 times. My name wasn't in it. It wouldn't be. I was a woman who'd carried champagne and stayed after the speeches to stack chairs, and no one at that gala would remember me specifically, which was, as it turns out, exactly what I needed to be. The following week, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer it. It was Meredith. She asked if she could meet for coffee. She named a cafe on Cambie Street that I knew. A small place, not the kind of spot that gets written about in food magazines, just a neighborhood cafe with good light and tables that weren't crowded together. The kind of place someone chooses when they want to talk without being overheard. I said yes. She was already there when I arrived, sitting with her hands around a mug, dressed in the kind of understated way that costs more than it looks. Without the gala context, without the careful performance of the ballroom, she looked different. Still composed. But the composure was sitting differently on her. Less like armor, more like something she'd put on out of habit and was thinking about taking off. She thanked me again. More fully this time, with specifics, what the fraud had actually involved, what Monday's filing would have meant for her father's endowment, what the investigation had uncovered beyond what she'd initially told the commission. She didn't tell me everything, because there were things she clearly couldn't tell me, but she told me enough to understand the scale of what had almost happened. He'd been planning it for 2 years, she said. Before we were even engaged, he identified my father as the entry point and worked backwards from there. I didn't say anything, because there isn't anything to say to something like that. I keep thinking about the moments I almost knew, she said. The questions I almost asked. The times I'd notice something and decide not to follow the thread, because the alternative was, she stopped. You know. I know, I said. She looked at me across the table. What are you doing now? Work-wise, I mean. Are you still catering? I told her I was. Told her about the rent and the student loans and the journalism degree, filed away somewhere I hadn't opened in 4 years. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm on the board of a civic journalism foundation. We fund investigative reporting on financial systems in BC. We've been trying to hire a researcher for 6 months. Someone who understands how investment fraud works, how it's documented, how to find the paper trail inside the language that's designed to hide it. She paused. Someone who knows how to look. I set my coffee down. I should mention, she added, that it's a real position, properly compensated. I'm not doing this because I feel like I owe you something, though I do. I'm doing this because after what you explained in that lounge, in 10 minutes, without notes, I think you're exactly the kind of person we need. I looked out the window at Cambie Street. A city bus went by. 2 people walked a dog. Everything was ordinary. Okay, I said. She nodded, the way people nod when they were fairly sure, but needed the confirmation anyway. We finished our coffee. She told me to expect a call from the foundation's executive director early the following week. She told me the work was difficult, and sometimes slow, and occasionally nothing happened for months and then everything happened at once. She said it was the kind of work where you spent a long time looking before you found anything, and you had to be comfortable with that. I told her I thought I could manage. On the drive home, I took the long way along the water. The North Shore Mountains were sitting where they always sit, enormous and unhurried, the way they are on clear days in October, when the air has finally given up on pretending to be warm. I thought about the gala, the corridor, the $40 in my account, the lease renewal, the journalism degree I'd been carrying around like something I was embarrassed to have paid for. I thought about what it means to be invisible in a room, how sometimes the people who see the most clearly are the ones no one thinks to guard against. The ones carrying the trays. The ones whose names don't appear on the seating cards. The ones who hear things because they've learned to move through spaces without disturbing them. I'd spent 4 years studying how to find things out. I'd spent the last 4 years trying to pretend that wasn't something I cared about. The mountains didn't have an opinion about this, which I appreciated. I pulled off the highway at the Burrard Street exit and drove the rest of the way home through the neighborhood, past the grocery store where I'd been rationing my grocery runs, past the corner where the coffee shop had recently raised its prices by $1.50, past my building with the landlord notice still taped to the front door. I sat in my car for a moment before going in. Then I went upstairs and I opened my laptop and I pulled up the Journalism Foundation's website and I read everything on it, every project, every report, every investigation. And I read it the way you read something when you're not deciding whether to do it, but trying to understand the shape of the thing you've already decided. It was late when I finally closed the laptop. Outside, the city kept going. The lights on the harbor, the mountains in the dark, still there even when you couldn't see them. The ordinary machinery of everything continuing, the way it does, regardless of what's happening inside any one person's apartment at 11:30 on a Tuesday night in October. But something had shifted. I'd walked into that ballroom, carrying a tray, invisible, in the way people decide to make themselves invisible when they need the money and don't have a better option yet. I was walking out of it as someone who had finally decided to stop pretending she didn't know how to look.